At the Nocturnist, we are careful to ensure that all stories comply with healthcare privacy laws. Details may have been changed to ensure patient confidentiality. All views expressed are those of the person speaking and not their employer.
Practicing medicine means exposure to mortality early and often. Sometimes we're right there with our patients when they get a new devastating diagnosis, and this can bring up our own fears of illness and mortality. Because while death is inevitable, being at peace with it is not. I'm Emily Silverman, and this is The Nocturnist, stories from the world of medicine. In this episode, internal medicine resident and founder of Twitter's MedHume chat, Colleen Farrell, comes to grips with a young woman's new brain cancer diagnosis. New to medicine, Colleen feels unprepared to handle this news. And in the conversation that follows, she and I muse about the lifelong task of coming to terms with our own mortality. But first, here is Colleen Farrell.
It's the end of summer, and I'm working in the emergency department. I've just finished my first 2 years of medical school, which means I've been learning medicine from textbooks, but the hospital is totally new to me, and I have no idea really how it works. I meet a patient that night who I'm going to call Ellen. She tells me that she's been having some double vision and nausea for a few months. I notice on her physical exam that when she looks to the side, her eyes wiggle back and forth in this way that's definitely not normal. And so we decide to get an MRI of her head. And on that MRI, we see a big mass inside her skull. We talk with radiologists and neurologists and surgeons, and everybody agrees that Ellen has a malignant, inoperable brain tumor. Growing up, I knew this kid named Billy. When we were about 10, Billy was diagnosed with brain cancer. I can still picture him in the gym of our elementary school playing basketball with this enormous scar on the side of his head. Each one of our classes in my school made a quilt square for him, and we put them together into a blanket that we sent him home with. "You Are My Sunshine" is the song that they played at his funeral. My mom says I was really curious about death growing up, that I asked all kinds of questions about it. What I remember is that I thought a lot about Billy. I used to picture him laying in bed, surrounded by his family members. And I would wonder what was going on inside his head. What is it like to know that you're going to die? What do you think about? And it was in thinking about Billy that I had my first inclination that I wanted to become a doctor. What's kind of interesting to me looking back is that I didn't have this hope of becoming the heroic surgeon who would cut open his brain or remove the cancer and save his life. I think I just wanted to be with him and be able to provide some kind of comfort while having those scary thoughts about death. Ellen was admitted to the hospital for a few days for further tests and to be seen by more specialists. As a medical student on her team, I would see her really early in the morning, and I'd wake her up and I'd say, "Oh, I'm so sorry to bother you." And I would make sure that she'd been getting enough medication for her nausea and that she wasn't in pain. But I never really talked to her about what was happening, about this diagnosis that she had received. So one day I'm leaving the hospital and I have my backpack on and I'm walking towards the elevators and I walk past Ellen's room. Somehow seeing her room, I remember that it's the day that she's supposed to be discharged from the hospital. She's going to go home with her husband. And so if I want to talk with her, like really talk with her, now is my chance. As soon as I think of having a real conversation with Ellen, my stomach is in a knot and I think about all the ways it could go wrong. Like, does she really want to talk to the medical student? And what if I say something that just makes it worse or makes her upset? And so I go through this whole line of thinking and convince myself that maybe I should just go to the elevator and go home. But I catch myself and I think about Billy and the kind of doctor that I want to be, and I force myself to at least try to be that kind of doctor. And so I walk back to Ellen's room, and outside her door, I put my backpack down. I unzip it, and from inside, I pull out my crumpled up white coat that I had taken off for the day, and I put it on me. Looking back, I realized that I wanted that white coat as a shield. I needed it to separate me from Ellen and the reality that she was now facing her death. I walked in her room and saw her laying in bed, her husband sitting next to her. He was hunched over, had this pensive look on his face, and his beard had grown out longer. Immediately, this big lump swelled up in my throat, and I knew that as soon as I tried to speak, I would begin to cry. Ellen looked at me with this remarkable, loving kindness in her eyes that I will never forget. She could tell that I was on the verge of tears, and she said to me, "Enjoy your life, and don't lose your empathy." I went home that night, and I fell to pieces. I was crying on the floor of my apartment. I didn't want Ellen to die. And I was also overwhelmed by the gulf between the doctor I wanted to become and who I felt I was. I knew that to be a great doctor, I would have to be able to face mortality, and I didn't know how to do that, and trying was terrifying. I didn't know what to do, so I went to bed, and I got up the next day, and I went back to the hospital. And I came home, and I went to bed, and I got up, and I went to the hospital. And I went to the hospital day after day for a year. And every day in the hospital, I met patients who were in very dark moments in their stories. And I didn't know what to do with all those stories that hurt so much. I didn't know how to process them. So they kind of just lived inside me. And when I finished that year, I was really, really depressed. I started having thoughts of wanting to kill myself. And what's kind of interesting to me about those thoughts is the way my patients' stories wove themselves into them. I spent a lot of time in the operating room as a medical student, where I learned how to hold a scalpel. I learned the locations of the most important blood vessels in our bodies. I touched somebody's aorta with my gloved fingers. And so in my own difficult moments, I would imagine taking a scalpel to my own arteries. I met several patients that year who were dying of liver failure. Their bodies were swollen and yellow and often bleeding. And I would think about the medications that I could take that would make my liver fail, that would make my body swell and turn yellow and bleed. I would think about Ellen and how one day you could be going on a hike with your family, and then the next day you could find out that this cancer was growing inside your head all along. I couldn't make sense of that. Like, how does that happen? And what do you do with that? Once I had time away from the hospital, I could focus on my own healing. I would go for these long walks each morning along the Charles River. It was fall, and I loved looking at the leaves. Now, first they were yellow, and then they would start to turn orange, and by the end of fall, they were brown and crispy. I would watch as the wind whipped through the branches of the trees. The leaves would dance in the wind, and then when I looked closely, I would see their little stems clinging with dear life to their branches. And then, randomly, some of them would fall to the ground. Later that fall, something really unexpected happened. I was in a coffee shop. I was perched on a high countertop, enjoying a latte and a pastry, when across the way, I noticed somebody who looked familiar. I racked my brain trying to place him and eventually realized that it was Ellen's husband. I immediately was so curious. I had to know if he was alone or if he was with her. So I got up like I had to go to the bathroom and walked across the coffee shop until I could get a better view. And across from this man, I saw Ellen. Her cancer had definitely taken its toll, but there she was, alive, enjoying her coffee. Seeing Ellen that day really changed something for me. It had been over a year since I met her when I saw her in that coffee shop. And I realized that entire year, whenever I thought of her, all I thought about was that she was dying, and I hadn't thought at all about how she was also living. I realized I had gotten so consumed by these dark moments in my patients' stories that I was missing all the light. I thought about those leaves on the trees and how, before they fall to the ground, they are their most beautiful colors and they dance in the wind. And just like that, in my patients' lives, as they were facing so much pain and uncertainty and loss, there was often so much beauty. so much resilience, and so much connectedness. I watched as Ellen and her husband got up from the coffee shop. They walked outside holding hands into a beautiful fall day, with brown leaves at their feet and the trees glowing all around them. Thank you.
Hi, Colleen.
Hi, Emily.
It's so good to hear your voice. How are you?
Likewise. I'm good. How are you?
Good. I'm so excited to talk to you about the story that you told at our show in New York City back in October. Maybe you could just briefly introduce yourself to the listeners.
Sure. I'm Colleen Farrell. I grew up in upstate New York, and I'm now an internal medicine resident at NYU in New York City.
Colleen is also the illustrious creator of the very popular new Twitter chat called MedHumChat, and I'd love to touch a little bit about that later. But first, I would love to hear a bit about your path to medicine.
In some ways, my path to medicine is very straightforward. I went to college intending to be pre-med, and I became a doctor. That's the story. But in another way, it was like a kind of winding path where there were moments when I really wasn't sure I would do it. And the decision became a lot more complex than I had anticipated. Largely because I started studying bioethics and gender studies and medical history, and I realized that medicine is way messier than learning science and using it to help people. You can actually do a lot of harm, and there's some really, really hard, messy decisions we have to make. So I spent a lot of time trying to convince myself trying to believe that I could become a doctor and be a good doctor, as in the sense of being a good person.
I would love to walk it back a little bit, if that's all right, and just hear a bit more about Billy. You say that he was acquaintance. He wasn't somebody who was super close to you, but was in your circle and in the community. Can you remind me, how old were you when that happened?
Well, I'm not entirely sure. I say 10 in the story. I recall going to his wake when I was in the 6th grade.
So pretty young.
Yeah.
Some people have exposure to death at that age, but usually it's more in the form of like a grandparent dying or something like that. But to have a peer die, at age 10 or in 6th grade, whatever it is, it's pretty early to be exposed to this question of mortality. Mm-hmm. And so I was wondering, even back then, being the thoughtful kind of person with the expansive mind that we all know that you have, did it cross your mind like, wow, that could have been me, or he's my age, or how did that frame your perspective on death at that young age?
Yeah. I don't recall having the thought so consciously or with such self-awareness. But I do recall crying in bed one night and my parents hearing me and coming to my room, and I remember telling them that I thought I had a brain tumor. So of course it was on my mind.
Right.
And these were the kinds of things that I would do that my mom would attribute to my curiosity about death. But it wasn't just curiosity. I think it was also enormous fear. But fear I kind of wanted to look at and then cover my eyes, and look at and cover my eyes.
Yeah, I think some young people have this feeling that they're invincible. And some people, when they see others get sick or die, have the opposite reaction, which is like, oh, that could just totally be me.
Definitely. I mean, I think there's this whole thing in neuroscience about mirror neurons. And our program director in my primary care residency, he has this thing where he asks us, when the patient points to, say, their left arm and they say, this hurts, do you say it's their left arm or their right arm? And if you mirror really strongly, if their left arm hurts, you'll point to your right arm because you're standing across from them and you feel that side hurting.
There are some thoughts that you mentioned in this story about, these people in your life who have become sick and died, going to medical school and seeing your patients start to be struck almost as if by lightning by these random diseases. They could be 85, they could be 25, it could happen to anyone at any time. And really grappling with that, you say, I think you even say in the story, or at least in the version that you performed live, you said you didn't have the time or the space or the skills to deal with. And I really want to zoom in on that word skill, because it really struck me. I just started wondering, exploring the darkness and coming to terms with our own mortality and our own vulnerability. Is that a skill? And if so, should we be teaching it to medical students in preparation for what they're going to see? And if so, how would we even begin to do that? And I'm just curious if you've ever thought about that.
Right. I love this question. I have observed in conversations in medical education around empathy that there's this idea that you have two options. On the one hand, you can feel a lot and you can get really close to your patients, and then you're going to get messed up and you're going to get too close and you're not going to be able to be rational, or you're going to fall apart, or you're going to become mentally ill. And so that's one option. And then on the other end, you protect yourself and you keep appropriate professional distance. And the danger there is that you become too cold and uncaring. So there's supposed to be these two poles, and you find some happy medium. And I was completely unsatisfied with these options. I was just like, there is no way that that's the only way to exist in the world. Mm-hmm. I just refuse to believe it. And so this is where I sometimes get frustrated too when people are like, oh, well, how should we teach this to medical students? And I think, well, forget medical students. How do we teach this to human beings? How do human beings learn this? These are enormous questions that, yes, are important for doctors, but doctors aren't the only ones facing these questions. I mean, these are the questions of parenting. These are the questions of religion and spirituality for millennia. These are, in many ways, questions of, I think, activists and social movements, like how do we face suffering? And so I kind of made a decision to look elsewhere for moral and spiritual guidance. Because at some level, we treat these questions of how do you face death as this is another medical school competency. But it's
as a skill.
Yes, but it is a skill, but it's a different kind of skill.
Right.
It's like deep wisdom. It's I also believe love is a skill, because I believe love is a verb. And when it comes to verbs, you practice verbs and you get better at doing them. You can get better at loving. And anyway, so in terms of how do we cultivate skills? Well, I think the people I'm currently looking to most to work on that skill is Buddhist teachers. And I know I've only dabbling in it, and I really owe it much more of a commitment. But it was so eye-opening for me. It's this incredible place called the Zen Center for Compassionate Care. And it was founded by these two Buddhist monks who actually met in a hospice. And they're particularly interested in working with people in healthcare, caretakers, and helping them face death. So here's this spiritual tradition that has existed for so long that people devote their lives to. And I think those people will tell you that they call it a practice.
I love that that's where your journey led you. And I'm wondering, for you, it sounds like the journey, there were some bumps in the road. It took for you to get into a pretty dark place before you came out of it and found that healing path and that healing process. And in my mind, it would be nice if students never had to get to the dark place. Maybe the solution isn't to teach the skill to medical students, but somehow cultivate a culture where students have space to find that answer for themselves.
I think that's really well said. And there was this moment that I got to where I really felt like becoming so depressed in medical school and really having to hit pause for a little while on my medical training. It was like my life went through a sifter, and I was left with only the most essential elements. I had this kind of epiphany in my kitchen one day when I finally could say to myself, with honesty. I could say honestly to myself, if I really think I'm going to kill myself if I don't leave medicine, I will leave medicine. This career is not worth my life. And it took me a really long time to get to that. And then getting to that was so liberating. I also, I just wanted to respond to one other thing you said about how we can in medical education and training give space for students to do that kind of important work. And I think a really important piece is role modeling. And not role modeling, oh, look at this epiphany I had, but role modeling vulnerability. That's what really prompted me to start telling my story, because I found that when people were just honest with me, like when an intern would say, third year of med school is really hard, it meant the world to me. Like, just let down your shield for a second and let me see you. And that was what helped me the most. And so I started just telling people in little side conversations that I'd gotten really depressed. And so many of them said, oh, me too, or my best friend, or I think I could use some help. And so the more I leaned into that, the more I realized what a way of helping people that can be, if we can be courageous in our vulnerability. And I think really being vulnerable in a true sense, I think that's one of the best ways to teach.
And I think role modeling and creating space are really important, but I think they're also, if we're going to accept that as true, if we're going to accept that medical students and residents and doctors are people, are human beings, there's going to have to be some structural changes made in the way that we make doctors, because in my experience, the schedule is it's like walking a tight wire, where if you're in perfect mental and physical health, you can walk that tight wire and probably get from one side to the other and be okay. But there's just no buffer zone. The minute that something happens, whether it's a bout of depression or an issue in a relationship or a family emergency, or in my case, it was actually I developed a physical medical issue, and it was like, oh, whoa, like I actually live in a body too. Like I actually am a person who could get sick. It's kind of weird, the mental backflips that physicians go through when they become vulnerable and how they try to hide it.
Right. That image of the tightrope, how we're really walking this, and if any just part of humanness comes out, that your body does normal body things, it is impossible to do it. Like I used to do these visualizations in the operating room where I would imagine the muscly walls of my bladder expanding, so that I could hold my pee for that long. There's this enormous irony that as you're learning to care for other people in their bodies, you become so disconnected from your own body and your very, very basic bodily needs.
I do want to touch on two more things before we part. The first is a line that struck me in your story when you are saying goodbye to Ellen in the hospital. And Ellen says to you, enjoy your life. And I'm just wondering if you've dived any deeper into that statement, or how you've taken that advice and put it into practice, if at all.
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. What do those words, enjoy your life, mean to me? I think I just heard her acknowledging how precious life is. And I don't know, maybe it really stood out working in a medical environment where something so simple often isn't stated. To be honest, they're not words that I have really spent that much time with, but rather just this feeling that how much went unsaid between us.
Mm-hmm.
Like my recollection of that day is that we really didn't talk about much more than I said in that story, that I came in and tried not to cry, and she said, enjoy your life and don't lose your empathy. Like that was kind of it, that we had met each other pre-diagnosis. Like, neither of us knew what was happening. And then she got this diagnosis, and we both heard about it separately. And she was told and had conversations and cried. And I was told, and I looked at the scans, and I pulled up all these articles about it, and I cried about it. And we were doing both those things separately. And so when I came to her and said goodbye, there was so much that didn't have to be said. And I think that's what I cherish so much about that moment. It made me feel seen by her. And I thought that was such a generous gift.
And it seems to me like she may have taken her own advice, or she had lived up to that philosophy, enjoy your life. And I think in an earlier version of your story, you make this distinction in your mind between being dead and dying, and how for you those two things used to feel like the same, and then they separated a bit in your mind.
Yeah, absolutely. I had this very strong sense of like that somebody who was dying was fundamentally different. And I think that was why I was so scared to go in that room. I was like, well, she's dying. That's different. I don't know. I just thought it was this different thing. And I don't think it was really till I saw Ellen later in that coffee shop that I realized this confusion that I had had between dying and being dead.
Yeah. And I think that's a distinction that that I had to make for myself too, as I began to interact with people who had terminal illnesses or maybe failing organs and they weren't candidate for transplants, and just like almost feeling kind of awkward around them sometimes and not quite knowing how to behave. And like you said, as if the situation is different or the interaction is different, or I should treat them different because they are dying.
There's this, I don't know if you know Andrew Solomon's book, Noonday Demon, about depression. In it, he talks about how his mother, I believe that his mother dies from physician-assisted suicide. And she like plans the day that she's going to die, and Andrew Solomon, the author, and his brother are there. And so it's the day the mother is going to die, and she knows she's going to die, and she scolds his brother for how he has laid these cookies out on a plate. And I just loved that detail so much. I was just like, people live and live and live until they die. Like, there's something so irrational and beautiful about that. I don't know. It's people care about the way cookies are on plates.
Right. They don't lose their little quirks. They don't lose their vanity. They don't lose their, personality. They're just them. Well, I do want to wrap up and talk a little bit about MedHume Chat, this amazing movement that you've started on Twitter. Can you tell us a bit about how you got the idea to do this, how you got started, the drivers behind it?
Yeah, totally. Thanks so much. So I love getting small groups of people together, people in medicine, and talking about poetry or stories. People can kind of put parts of themselves on the text and reveal parts of themselves without being too vulnerable. And I experienced that with my co-interns last year. We had this really cool block in my primary care program where we get like 8 weeks of psychosocial curriculum. And the interns actually designed their own curriculum for a lot of this time. And so I would print out like poems and a New Yorker article and short stories. I would carry them around with me. And so sometimes I would give out these poems to my co-interns, and people who I don't think identified as particularly interested in poetry had these incredible things to say. And I was like, well, why not do that with medical humanities? And so I tweeted out like, hey, is anybody doing this? If I had like a chat where we talked about poetry, would people be into it? And all these people were into it. So I was like, well, I guess I'll just do it. And that's kind of it. I have to say, I think the most meaningful response to it so far I got from a critical care doctor after our first chat, in which we read this poem called Intensive Care by the poet Jane O. Wayne. And the next day this doctor tweeted that because of reading that poem and reflecting on it, he spent more time with the family members of the patients he was caring for the next day. And I was like, if that, to me, is like, that is the magic of poetry and art and story, that it helps us find the parts of ourselves that connect with what we're doing and what really matters in what we're doing. And if I can create a space where one person like really spends more time connecting because of things that we've talked about and he's connected with within himself, that to me is worth so much.
I think so too. And I think what you're doing is what you said earlier, you're role modeling, and the impact of that is rippling out. And it may not be super easily measurable, but it's certainly powerful. And I just want to thank you for putting that community together. And I look forward to participating in many more MedHume chats.
Well, thank you so much. I am very excited to have you there.
All right. Well, I know that you are a busy resident with a busy schedule, so I will let you go.
This was such a really special opportunity for me, Emily. You have clearly created something magical, and it is really a pleasure to be part of it. So thank you.
Thanks so much for listening to Colleen's story. I know it really reflects the emotional journey that some of us go through in our training. Before we move on, I would like to pause here and just say a word about our plans for growth. In the last few years, the Nocturnist has really blossomed into this amazing national community of people who are passionate about using storytelling to bring humanism back into medicine. And we have so many ideas for how to continue this work next year and beyond, including producing season 3 of this podcast. But we're not able to do that without your support. At the moment, we're searching for people and organizations who want to support the Nocturnist in a significant way by joining our founding circle of donors. These are people who we hope will make a contribution to the Nocturnist and help sustain our future. So if you're interested in being one of those people, or if you know someone who might be interested, please reach out to me directly at thenocturnist@gmail.com and let's talk. Also, for any medical trainees who are listening, don't forget to check out our website and learn more about the Nocturnist Storytelling Contest. The theme of the contest is learning, so submit your story, and if it's selected, you could win a $500 cash prize and the chance to be featured on season 3 of our show. We can't wait to see what stories are out there. Thank you so much for listening. I'm Emily Silverman, host and creator of The Nocturnist. Special thanks to executive producer Ali Block, podcast producer Marina Poole, program coordinator and head of story development Adelaide Papazzolo, sound engineer Alberto Hernandez, assistant producer Kirk Clockey, our podcast intern Chloe Lassard, social media manager B. Logan, our illustrator Lindsay Mound, our composer Yessie Monroe, and the voice of Boaz Monroe, and our fundraising lead Cecilia Peterson. This episode's story was coached by Ilana Lancaster. And last but not least, thank you to our storyteller, Colleen Farrell. We are the Nocturnists. Until next time.